So, as I was saying before I was rudely interrupted by the telephone, Charles Brockden Brown was the American precursor for the Gothic novel. And he essentially took the sentimental plotline of the day, which was, a young lady being seduced and left after by a rake, right, the seducer. And he took that plot line and modified it a little bit. So if you take his novel Wieland, that's narrated by this young woman called Clara, she is actually not the one who is seduced off the path of righteousness. It's her brother, called Wieland. And so, he is seduced by this voice that he hears. And he thinks it's the voice of God because he can't see anyone speaking when he hears it. And so this voice gradually eggs him on to commit a terrible act. And in the end, he actually performs this act. And it's actually based on a true story that happened in America. This very religious farmer ritually sacrificed his whole family. And so in the end, we find out that it wasn't the voice of God that he was following, but he was actually being manipulated by this man called Carwin, who is a ventriloquist. And he's been hiding in a cupboard and making Wieland think that he's hearing the voice of God. So Carwin is this arch villain, and he doesn't actually get away with his evil deed in the end. He goes away without his reward, and he's kind of left wandering. So he's a kind of what's called in Gothic literature a wandering Jew figure. The Wandering Jew is this apocryphal story linked to the Bible, in which the Jew that didn't help Christ on the way up the Via Dolorosa to Golgotha is punished, and he is punished by being made to wander the earth forever. So Carwin is a bit of a wandering Jew figure in that, at the end of that novel called Wieland also. And so Clara, the narrator, is not the one who's seduced. She is the one who narrates the tale and gets away from her brother, who also wants to kill her, but in the end relents. So he stands in there for the unprincipled aristocrat, even though he's just a farmer who is running after the damsel in distress, his own sister in this case. So you see the way he adapts, Brockden Brown adapts the Gothic to suit his own purposes and to suit the American landscape. The cave that is in Edgar Huntley, his other famous novel, is a kind of labyrinth also. So it's a kind of natural stand-in for the labyrinthine castle or the labyrinthine abbey that you get in European Gothic. Now there are sort of four main reasons why the Gothic flourished in America, even though it seemed like an unlikely place for the Gothic to flourish, because it has no castles mostly, because it had no feudal system, no ancient societies, no ancient traditions. So those main reasons are first the Puritan legacy, right? So in European Gothic you have this malign legacy, which can be a sort of curse on your family, for the sins committed by your ancestors, for example. But in America you have the Puritan legacy, which is you could say, well, the sins committed by the Puritans, the most famous of these being the Salem witch trials, in which a whole big village was essentially wiped out by fanatics who believed that the villagers were pactizing with the devil. This is a historical fact. So this terrible legacy was taken up as something, a special guilt, a special shame that needed to be expunged, that needed to be atoned for. And Nathaniel Hawthorne is the writer who mostly deals with that special shame, that badge of shame. Now, the other main locus for the Gothic is the frontier, which is the spreading of the frontier towards the west as Americans gradually conquered the west of America. Right, that's called the frontier. So moving west gradually, that was also a source of terrible things. Often because it meant the massacring of Indians, the committing of terrible deeds, in search of gold, in search of land. The gold rush, for example, is a kind of Faustian pact in itself. So those two sort of facts, and you also had an interest in political utopianism. Now, political utopianism is a fascination that there was among the pioneers in America for the perfect worlds. Right? America itself, being the New World, was a kind of utopian place. At least it was imagined, fantasized as a utopian place, where a lot of Europeans flocked to create these micro-societies, these kind of utopian places. Nathaniel Hawthorne even went to one himself called Brook Farm with the Transcendentalists, the Transcendentalist poets of Boston. And he satirized that in one of his novels, actually. So a lot of intellectuals created these utopian communities, and so utopia often leads to a form of dystopia. So that was ideal for the purposes of Gothic writers. And Charles Brockden Brown actually sent his novel Wieland to Thomas Jefferson, and you could interpret that as a kind of gesture that kind of underwrites, that validates Jefferson's belief, his federalist belief, that the people couldn't govern themselves, that religion and education weren't enough, and that self-governing was ultimately not viable. So the fact that he sent Wieland, this novel about religious fanaticism gone awry, is a symbol. So it suggests his affiliation with federalist politics, right? The idea that the government must intervene and that all American states should be under the same laws, at least for the major laws. So that ultimately is a criticism of utopianism, the novel Wieland. And lastly, the last sort of major point in which the Gothic flourished was race relations. Another one of America's guilts. There wasn't so much guilt over the slaughter of the Indians, but more guilt over the treatment of African Americans. Most notably in Toni Morrison's Beloved, for example, right? The legacy of slavery there is Gothicized and presented as the horror that it was. But before that too, there was a kind of shame, maybe not always explicitly mentioned, but that comes out in Gothic form, almost what Freud called the return of the repressed. So you could say that, you know, the Gothic horror is a kind of implicit reflection of the sins of the forefathers against African Americans. So ultimately, you know, there are quite a few major American short stories and Gothic novels that, you know, have entered the canon of world literature. So it's not a side genre, a minor genre. It is really central to American literature. If you think of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, you know, that's one of the most famous American short stories. Edgar Allan Poe has contributed some of the most famous ones, like William Wilson, which is set mostly in a European Gothic tradition of the kind of the ancient manor and the labyrinth inside those old constructions in Europe. And the House of Usher, you know, the Fall of the House of Usher, another of his short stories, is set in an ancient manor that collapses. So there is a substantial collection of short stories there that need reading. Yeah. So another novel that you might read, and I'll finish on that, is Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that isn't explicitly Gothic, but there are moments of terror in there that are Gothic, even though they're often tempered by faith in God. So you could say that she offered a kind of Christian Gothic that tempered the kind of godless or damned Gothic that you often find in European Gothic stories. Thank you. Bye.